Since childhood, we have been told that the planet is overpopulated, that there is not enough food, that we are superfluous. But what if all this is a lie? The idea of overpopulation is not based on facts, but on interests, foundations, corporations, governments. The real figures tell a different story. Humanity is not growing, it is disappearing. Who wants us to become fewer? Why are we being made to fear ourselves? You will learn what is not reported in the news. This video will change your view of the number that everyone fears: 8 billion. When a person first uttered the words, "There are too many of us," they were most likely looking not at a crowd, but at a desert. The idea of overpopulation was not born out of reality. It was born out of fear. And fear, as we know, is easy to control and scale. The roots of this fear go back to the end of the 18th century. Back then, in 1798, an English priest and economist named Thomas Malthus published his work, An Essay on the Principle of Population. In it, he argued that the Earth's population was growing exponentially, while resources were growing only arithmetically. In other words, there would soon be too many people to feed. Malthus's theory caused quite a stir. It seemed frighteningly logical and ideologically convenient. European elites seized upon it as an explanation for poverty and a justification for inequality. After all, if the poor suffer from a lack of food, it is not because the rich exploit the poor, but because there are simply too many poor people. Malthus was not a madman. He was simply wrong. He could not predict the Industrial Revolution or the Green Revolution in agriculture, and he did not take technological progress into account. But his ideas, despite their scientific inconsistency, lived on. They found a second life in politics and became the basis for harsh social doctrines. In the 19th century, the idea of overpopulation was increasingly used to justify colonialism. Civilized peoples, it was said, had to control the savages, otherwise they would multiply and cause chaos. This was a cover for the seizure of resources and labor. By the beginning of the 20th century, fear of overpopulation had become part of the academic mainstream. Universities and newspapers discussed how many people the planet could sustain. The first environmental alarmists appeared, scientists who predicted the imminent end of the world due to a demographic explosion. These predictions did not come true, but each time they had an effect. They frightened, disciplined, and turned people against themselves. In the mid-20th century, after World War II, the idea of a demographic threat reached a new level. In the United States, active demographic propaganda began. Against the backdrop of the Cold War and population growth in the Third World, especially in Asia and Africa, the White House and the Pentagon began to say, overpopulation is a threat to global stability. In 1968, Paul Ehrlich's book, The Population Bomb, was published. It became a bestseller. In it, the author predicted mass starvation, disasters, and wars if humanity did not urgently reduce its numbers. He called for harsh measures: sterilization, birth control, and restrictions on parental rights. These ideas gained widespread support in elite circles, especially among the owners of transnational corporations and banks. At the same time, in 1970, the so-called Club of Rome was founded, an international non-governmental organization comprising former politicians, financiers, and scientists. Their report, The Limits to Growth, claimed that the Earth could not sustain population growth and consumption. It was also the first time the idea was put forward that human population growth must be restrained in order to save the planet. It was tacitly assumed that growth in poor countries needed to be restrained in particular. Thus, in a matter of decades, the myth of overpopulation was transformed from a hypothesis into a political tool. It became an argument for intervention in the internal affairs of states, a justification for economic sanctions, and even a cover for population sterilization operations in developing countries. It is important to understand that all this happened not because the Earth really could not cope. It was because the idea of surplus people allowed the masses to be controlled. It allowed attention to be diverted from the redistribution of resources, from financial bubbles, from the real causes of poverty and war. Most importantly, it allowed the feeling to be created that human beings themselves are a threat. That is why the idea of overpopulation persists, despite the fact that the real figures have long since disproved it. It is not science or facts that keep it alive, but those who benefit from us being afraid of each other, or of ourselves. If we remove emotion and look at the facts, the picture becomes surprisingly clear. Contrary to popular belief, the world is not heading for disaster because of an excess of people. On the contrary, it is preparing for an era of demographic decline. Population growth is slowing down, and in some countries there is already a rapid decline. Paradoxically, in the 21st century, the main threat is not overpopulation, but extinction. In the middle of the 20th century, there was indeed a demographic boom. After the end of the Second World War, mortality rates fell sharply, especially in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Sanitary conditions improved, vaccines appeared, and aid programs began. But at the same time, the so-called demographic transition began. As living standards rose, families began to have fewer children. Today, this process has spread to almost the entire world. According to the United Nations, the population growth rate has been steadily declining since the beginning of the 2000s. In the 1960s, the Earth's population grew by about 2% annually. Now it is less than 1%. By the end of the century, zero growth is predicted, followed by negative growth. The countries that were the first to achieve high levels of development have long been experiencing a demographic winter. In Japan, the population has been declining for the 5th consecutive year. In Germany, the death rate consistently exceeds the birth rate. The situation is similar in Italy, Spain, and South Korea. In some cities, houses have already begun to be demolished because there is no one to live in them. China deserves special attention. For a long time, it was a symbol of overpopulation. But in reality, after the one-child policy introduced in the 1970s, the country has reached the brink of a demographic cliff. China is now losing millions of citizens every year. By the end of the 21st century, its population could decline by 300 million people. Similar processes are underway in India. Despite overall growth, many states are already showing birth rates below replacement levels. In a few decades, the country will begin to lose population, as is already happening in Bangladesh and Sri Lanka. Only the African continent continues to grow rapidly. But even there, signs of a slowdown are visible. Education levels are rising, access to medicine is expanding, and as a result, families are becoming smaller. Predictions that Africa will overpopulate the planet are based on linear extrapolation that does not take into account changes in lifestyle. Moreover, if there really were a risk of resource shortages, it would manifest itself not on a global scale, but locally, in the form of famine and disasters. But statistics show that over the past 30 years, the level of hunger in the world has declined. The exceptions are not related to the number of people, but to wars, corruption, and economic sanctions. Even in densely populated countries, population density is far from critical. For example, the entire population of the planet, 8 billion people, could fit into an area the size of Brazil with a population density similar to that of the Netherlands. And the Netherlands, incidentally, is one of the world's largest food exporters. The main problem is not the number of people, but the uneven distribution of resources. People do not live equally, not because there are too many of them, but because resources are concentrated in the hands of a minority. 5% of the population controls almost 80% of all wealth. This is not a consequence of demographics, but of the economic system. But the myth of overpopulation is convenient. It allows us to avoid talking about this imbalance. It makes the victim feel guilty. People themselves begin to see themselves as a burden. Young couples refuse to have children because they fear burdening the planet. School children are taught that their birth is an ecological mistake, and politicians are given an argument for cutting social programs, abolishing benefits, and imposing birth control. The irony is that demographic decline has serious consequences. An aging population, a shortage of workers, and an increase in the tax burden. Commissions to encourage childbirth are already being set up in Europe and East Asia. Countries that until recently feared population growth are now begging their citizens to have children. As is so often the case, the truth is completely opposite to the propaganda. The Earth is not suffering from an excess of people. It is suffering from the fact that human beings are ceasing to be valued. They are being replaced by algorithms, robots, and optimization schemes. In this context, the fear of overpopulation is nothing more than a smokescreen. It hides the real anxiety of the elites, that one day people will realize that there are not too many of them, and that there is too little freedom, justice, and truth. When the same idea is repeated in reports, books, speeches by politicians, and even school textbooks, it is important to ask who is promoting it. Who says there are too many of us? And most importantly, why? One of the main sources of demographic panic has been international foundations and influential think tanks. One of the first was the Club of Rome, founded in 1972. Its reports, especially the limits to growth, were funded by major banks and transnational corporations. They painted a picture of apocalypse. If the human population is not limited, collapse is coming. But the Club of Rome is just the tip of the iceberg. Private charitable foundations, such as the Rockefeller Foundation, have had a more profound influence. Back in the mid-20th century, this foundation funded demographic research aimed at justifying the need for birth control. This led to forced sterilization programs in India, Peru, and later in a number of African countries. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation continues this line of work under a new guise. It officially promotes projects in the fields of health, vaccination, and education. However, a significant part of its efforts is directed towards reproductive health, a euphemism that often hides birth control and sterilization programs. In several African countries, there have already been cases where vaccines supplied through international agencies have caused mass infertility in women. This has been documented, but rarely makes the headlines. The United Nations has not stood idly by either. Its agencies, especially the UNFPA, Population Fund, have been promoting birth control for decades, especially in developing countries. In doing so, They have collaborated with governments to implement programs that often disregard cultural differences and violate human rights. All this has been done under the slogans of sustainable development and family planning. It is curious that it is precisely the poor regions that are the targets of these initiatives. Africa, South Asia, Latin America. That is where billions of dollars are being directed for population control. Why not Europe, where the birth rate is already catastrophically low? The answer is obvious. Reducing the population in poor countries is seen as a way to control resources and geopolitical risks. Sometimes direct rhetoric is used. In 1992, Ted Turner, founder of CNN, stated that the ideal population of humanity is no more than 2 billion people. In 2006, Bill Gates said during a lecture that new vaccines, healthcare, and reproductive health could reduce population growth by 10 to 15%. These statements did not cause any scandal. On the contrary, they were met with applause from experts. The media, controlled by the same groups, propagate the thesis of overpopulation as an indisputable truth. Documentaries, articles, blogs, infographics. All of this creates the impression that the number of people has indeed spiraled out of control. Against this backdrop, any measures to reduce it appear to be beneficial. School textbooks in various countries include chapters on the demographic threat. Students around the world study theories according to which sustainable development is impossible without population reduction. Universities are creating departments of demography, funded by the same foundations that promote the idea of surplus people. Finally, climate movements have also become a tool for this rhetoric. Many activists openly declare that humanity is a virus. One of the leaders of the Extinction Rebellion movement in the United Kingdom said, "Human life only has meaning if it does not interfere with the planet." Such phrases create a new ethic, an ethic of self-destruction. All these sources and voices say the same thing. There are too many people. But if they repeat it so insistently, it means that someone needs it. And, as experience shows, most often it is not for the good of humanity itself. When people talk about population control, they rarely mention the real methods that have been and are being used. Behind the innocuous words reproductive health and family planning often lie harsh and sometimes barbaric measures aimed at directly reducing the number of people, especially in poor and vulnerable communities. One of the most notorious examples is India. In the 1970s, the Indian government, with support from the World Bank and the Rockefeller Foundation, launched a large-scale sterilization program. Under the guise of medical care, hundreds of thousands of men and women underwent operations to deprive them of their reproductive functions, often without their full consent. There were cases where sterilization was carried out in exchange for food, housing, or access to medicine. Thousands of victims never received compensation. Similar cases were reported in Peru, where a campaign of forced sterilization of the indigenous population was launched in the 1990s under the guise of improving living standards. The operations were carried out in field conditions with minimal safety guarantees. Women suffered from the consequences, including infections, infertility, and psychological trauma. All this was presented as international aid. In China, the one-child policy, which was in force from the late 1970s to the early 2000s, became an example of total state control over birth rates. Women were forced to have late-term abortions, families were destroyed, and fines were imposed for the illegal birth of a second child. In practice, this was accompanied by violence, surveillance, and humiliation. And all this was presented as an act of caring for the future of the nation. In Africa, family planning programs often go hand in hand with humanitarian aid. Women are offered contraceptives they know nothing about. Local doctors and NGOs receive funding if they achieve certain targets for reducing the birth rate. Vaccination and sterilization go hand in hand, and in some cases, literally in the same syringe. Abortion has also become part of global demographic policy. It is actively supported by international organizations in countries where population size is considered a threat. In some Latin American countries, women were denied tubal ligation after abortion without their consent. This was considered prevention of new problems. At the same time, education programs play a key role. Young people are made to believe that children are a burden. Advertising and educational materials shape attitudes towards postponing childbirth, avoiding large families, and sometimes even rejecting parenthood altogether. Such propaganda is presented as freedom of choice, but in reality, it is an imposed norm. The paradox is that these measures aimed at reducing the population often have the opposite effect in the long term. Declining birth rates lead to an aging population, a shortage of labor, and a social divide between generations. And restoring the lost demographic balance is extremely difficult. But no one is talking about this yet. The dominant rhetoric is responsible parenthood, family planning, and reducing poverty by reducing birth rates. It all sounds humane, but behind this, humanity lies cold calculation. The idea is simple. Fewer people means fewer problems. And that means any means are acceptable. In today's world, where data is becoming currency, human life is increasingly turning into a statistical indicator. Who was born, how long they lived, how many children they had. All of this becomes part of global tables. And in these tables, some people have long been considered superfluous. The main question is, who exactly decides this, and why? Any fear becomes particularly dangerous when it is used as a tool. The myth of overpopulation is just such a fear. It has been instilled for generations, it is propagated relentlessly, and most importantly, it gives power. After all, if society believes that there are too many people, it will voluntarily accept restrictions, and this opens the door to control. Invisible but deeply ingrained in the consciousness. It all starts with guilt. People are made to believe that their very existence is a problem. The birth of a child is presented not as a joy, but as a blow to the planet. Mass culture promotes the image of selfish parents who supposedly harm the environment. The idea of motherhood is increasingly devalued. According to modern rhetoric, fathers are becoming unnecessary figures altogether. The media reinforces this narrative. Articles regularly appear in the news. The world is on the brink of overpopulation. The planet does not have enough resources. Every new person is a step towards disaster. These headlines instill panic, which then turns into policy. Politicians start talking about the need for reform. But behind these reforms, there is almost always one thing: reducing the birth rate and increasing control. Young people are being offered conscious childlessness. Thousands of bloggers appear on YouTube, TikTok, and Instagram explaining why it's not worth having children in this world. This idea is fashionable. It is supported by algorithms and promoted to the top. Those who speak differently about family values, about parenting, become marginalized. At the same time, large corporations are given a golden opportunity to absolve themselves of responsibility. Instead of restructuring production, reducing emissions, or abandoning aggressive expansion, they simply point the finger at the population. It's your fault. You eat too much, drive too much, consume too much. People accept this blame and begin to restrict themselves voluntarily. The myth of overpopulation becomes the basis for new taxes, restrictions, and digital quotas. In a number of countries, ideas for a personal carbon footprint are already being discussed, where each person would receive a limit on food, travel, and heating. Exceeding this limit would result in fines. The basis for this control? The same fear: there are too many of us. Children are being taught that they are harmful to the planet. School textbooks contain assignments such as calculate how many resources you consume per year. Pupils draw diagrams in which a family with 3 children is the source of disaster. This is not just misinformation. It is programming future behavior. Even the climate agenda is increasingly being presented in a demographic guise. Leading activists are calling for a reduction in the birth rate as a way of combating climate change. This is convenient. It allows the real causes of environmental problems, corporate greed, resource monopolization, inefficient technologies, to be left untouched. It is much easier to blame the individual. This is how a new model of governance is created. Voluntary submission based on fear and guilt. People cease to be subjects. They become objects of regulation. And the myth of overpopulation is the key to this transformation. We are not being forced. We are being persuaded. And without noticing, we are surrendering our rights, our freedom, and even our future children, in the name of the planet, development, and sustainability. But who really needs this? One of the main arguments in favor of overpopulation has always been the scarcity of resources. They say that there are more and more people, but less and less food, water, and land. However, if you dig deeper, this logic falls apart. It is not about the quantity of resources. It is about how they are distributed, or, more precisely, who controls them. Let's start with land. There are billions of hectares of fertile soil on the planet. Many regions remain sparsely populated or completely empty. In Russia alone, there are tens of millions of hectares of agricultural land that lie fallow. The situation is similar in Canada, Brazil, and Argentina. The population density in these countries is significantly lower than in Europe. This means that the problem is not one of scarcity, but of utilization. Now let's look at water. There is a persistent myth that the Earth's fresh water reserves are running out. But in reality, the global water cycle is capable of supporting tens of times more people than currently live on Earth. The problem lies in pollution, infrastructure, and access, especially in poor countries. Where companies have privatized water sources, the local population is cut off from water, even if it is abundant. Food is another myth. Today, humanity produces enough food to feed more than 10 billion people. This is according to official estimates by the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. The problem lies in logistics, speculation, and the destruction of food for the sake of prices. Every year, millions of tons of food are simply thrown away. Not because there is nowhere to put it, but because it is more profitable. Energy is also an illusion of scarcity. There is enough oil, gas, and uranium to last for centuries. And alternative sources, such as solar and wind, are growing exponentially. Technology is improving, but access to it is still controlled by patents, investment, and regulations. Again, it is not a question of scarcity, but of access. There is one recurring theme in all these areas. Resources exist, but they are owned by a narrow stratum of society. These people do not suffer from overpopulation. On the contrary, they use this idea to consolidate their superiority. Telling society, "There are too many of us," means preparing it not to demand more, not to strive for improvement, and not to ask uncomfortable questions. A telling example is the housing market. In cities around the world, luxurious skyscrapers are being built and left empty. Apartments are bought up as investments and remain unoccupied. Millions of people are homeless, while houses stand empty. And all this against a backdrop of talk about lack of space and overcrowding. There are hundreds of similar examples. In Africa, companies pump out water and transport it abroad. In Latin America, forests are being cut down to grow crops for export. In Asia, land is being bought up, displacing local farmers. None of this has anything to do with natural overpopulation. It is the result of policy. But to prevent anyone from asking questions, a simple answer is needed. An answer that explains everything. The idea of overpopulation is just such an answer. People begin to think that poverty, hunger, and war are simply a consequence of population size, and they cease to see the mechanisms of control behind it. But resources are not a problem. They are an opportunity. If they are managed wisely and fairly, the Earth can support a much larger population than it does now. But then, the main lever of power would disappear. And so, it is easier to convince the world that there are too many of you than to admit that you have too few rights. When the question is asked directly, who benefits from there being fewer of us? The answer seems complicated. But if you look closely at the consequences rather than the slogans, everything becomes clear. Population reduction benefits those who seek control, not equality. Those who want fewer human factors and more predictability. In the past, labor was the main value. People were needed in factories, on construction sites, in the army. Large families were considered a blessing, and the state encouraged childbirth. But with the development of automation and digitalization, the picture has changed. Machines, programs, robots, all this makes people less and less necessary. They are becoming redundant, especially if they are poor, free, and inconvenient. The elites do not need billions of independent citizens. They need people who are controllable, dependent on digital infrastructure, and easily replaceable by algorithms. The fewer people there are, the easier it is to impose a single model of thinking, behavior, and control. The easier it is to build a new order, digital, environmentally friendly, but inhuman. Population decline is also convenient for the redistribution of power. Fewer people means less resistance, less diversity, less risk. Countries with declining populations become more pliable, more obedient. They are easier to integrate into global schemes. Large corporations gain a market where consumption is stable and controllable. People no longer act as an unpredictable force. They become elements of the system. Their behavior is easy to model, especially if they are burdened by fears about the environment, the future, responsibility for their children. Finally, population decline destroys traditional values. The family as an institution is disappearing. In its place is individualism, digital identity, and loyalty not to people but to platforms. It's convenient, it's effective, and it's dangerous. This does not mean that there is a sinister committee sitting in some underground chamber writing a plan to reduce the population. Rather, it is a combination of interests, trends, and ideologies. But the result is the same. People are gradually being excluded from equations, from plans, from the future. And that is why today, the most important question is not how many of us will there be, but who will we become? A statistical unit? Or a living, valuable being who has the right to exist, regardless of the numbers in graphs and plans in someone's office?